Where I began, I grew up in Maplewood, a small, sleepy town nestled in the rolling green hills of Vermont. Life here was simple, almost predictable, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest excitement was the annual fall fair or Sunday morning pancakes at the local diner. My world revolved around my parents, who ran a little bookstore on the main street, and my younger brother, Sam, whose laughter filled every corner of our rickety old house. We weren't rich, but in so many ways, we had everything that mattered: warmth, safety, and unconditional love. As a child, I loved to spend hours wandering the woods behind our house, breathing in the sharp scent of pine, listening to the chorus of birds, and filling my pockets with smooth stones and wildflowers. My mother always said I was a dreamer, the kind of girl who could find magic in a shadow or a story in every silent moment. At school, I was the quiet one in the back row, the kid who read novels under the desk while the others whispered about crushes and parties. Some called me shy, others thought I was aloof, but I was just comfortable in my own skin. At least I thought I was. Everything changed when I left Maplewood for college at the University of Vermont. Suddenly, the world felt bigger, noisier, and I had to find my place all over again. There were late-night study sessions, friendships formed over shared slices of pizza, heartbreaks that felt like the end of the world, and victories that tasted so much sweeter for their rarity. I learned who I was outside the confines of my hometown, and I learned what I wanted. Not just a love story, but a life that mattered. That's where Michael Walker came in. We met in my senior year, in a crowded lecture hall, where he asked if he could borrow my notes. Michael was nothing like the boys I'd known. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, an easy smile, and a curiosity about the world that matched my own. At first, we were friends, walking across campus in the dead of winter, talking about books and dreams, in the strange ways family could both bind and break us. I remember the first time he took me to his family's house, a sprawling estate that looked like something out of a movie, all gleaming windows and manicured lawns. It was overwhelming, stepping into a world so different from my own. The Walkers were a legacy in Maplewood, known for their wealth, their charity galas, the way their name was spoken in a hushed, reverent tone. Michael reassured me that money didn't matter, that what counted was who we were together. Young and hopeful, I believed him. I believed that love was enough, that sincerity could bridge any divide, that kindness always found its way through. Looking back now, I can see how naive I was. But standing at the edge of that new life, all I felt was hope, a hope so strong it could almost drown out the anxiety, quietly thrumming beneath the surface. If only I'd known what lay ahead, I might have held on tighter to that innocent faith, or braced myself better for the storm to come. Behind the glittering facade, stepping into the Walker estate for the first time was like entering a different universe. The gate alone was taller than our bookstore back in Maplewood, gleaming black iron with the Walker W curved elegantly in the center. As Michael's car rolled down the immaculate driveway, flanked by towering oaks and perfectly trimmed hedges, I tried to quiet the jittery feeling in my stomach. The house itself, if you could even call it just a house, was straight out of a magazine, sprawling, endless windows reflecting the early autumn sunlight, white columns rising up to a balcony adorned with pots of tulips. Inside, every detail sparkled, and everything had its place. Delicate porcelain vases from travels around the world lined the mantels, and framed photographs told the story of a family that always seemed to be dressed for some grand occasion. The art on the walls was the kind you weren't supposed to touch. And there was an entire sitting room no one actually sat in. It was hard not to feel like an outsider, tiptoeing across floors so polished you could see your own startled face staring back. But the grandeur was only the first layer. Underneath, there was a set of rules, unspoken but rigid, that I quickly learned to navigate. The Walkers had traditions for everything. Sunday brunches, where silver trays gleamed with fresh pastries, dinners that demanded the right outfit and the right story to tell, parties with people whose names I could never remember, all congratulating the family on their latest business success or charity event. Martha, my mother-in-law, presided over all of it like a queen. To the world, she was grace and composure, her laughter precise, her posture always perfect, her words chosen like jewels. She spoke to me with polite affection, her eyes skimming over details. The first few weeks, I clung to the hope that I could fit in if I was just careful enough. If I set the table exactly the right way, brought the right hostess gift, laughed at the right moments. But the sense of being tested, watched, never left me. I noticed how Martha's compliments came with an edge. "You've done so well for someone from such a humble background. It's not your fault you weren't taught these things." Jessica, Michael's older sister, was more subtle still, a dazzling smile at dinner, but whispered reminders of my little mistakes when we were alone, suggestions that maybe I should leave the family matters to them. I spent hours second-guessing myself, afraid of stepping out of line, desperate not to embarrass Michael. I wondered if anyone else felt as out of place as I did. The grand parties that should have been exciting filled me with dread. I learned to fake smiles and let my heart sink quietly when they made me feel like a guest in my own life. Looking back, I realize how much of my energy was spent just trying to blend into the background, to avoid the quiet barbs and the icy glances. Behind all the glamour and gloss of the Walker name was a world where appearances were everything and kindness was rationed. The Walker estate was beautiful, yes, but I was beginning to learn that beauty could be the most fragile mask of all. Silent schemes. Looking back, I can pinpoint the moment my life inside the Walker estate shifted from uncomfortable to downright unnerving. It was subtle at first, a whisper of tension floating in the air, barely noticeable, an icy look from Martha, or a comment from Jessica that seemed harmless on the surface, but stung hours later when I turned it over in my mind. The first incident came one rainy afternoon in late October, just a few weeks after I'd moved in. I'd offered to help in the kitchen, eager to show Martha I could contribute. She assigned me to set the table for dinner, her instructions crisp and precise. I meticulously counted out the fine china, just as she demonstrated, making sure each knife and fork lined up exactly. When the family assembled, though, Martha immediately noticed 2 spoons were missing. Her voice was gentle on the edges, but sharp in the core. "It's all right, Emily. Mistakes happen when you're not used to formal dining. I'm sure your family did things differently." The way her words danced between sympathy and criticism sent heat rushing to my cheeks. That was just the beginning. Suddenly, small, inexplicable mistakes began to happen all around me. A vase missing from the sitting room I dusted that morning. Letters gone from Michael's office that he distinctly remembered placing on his desk. Family silver showing up tarnished, though I'd never touched it. Each time, Martha or Jessica would discover the mishap, then look at me with this unsettling mix of pity and suspicion. At first, I blamed myself, wondering if the pressure of fitting in was making me careless. Gradually, though, it dawned on me. Someone wanted me to feel this way. Jessica was particularly skilled at sowing doubt with a smile. She would accidentally mention to Michael that I seemed stressed, that perhaps I wasn't sleeping well, that she'd seen me wandering the halls late at night. If Michael ever asked, I brushed it off, not wanting to feed the narrative they were spinning. Meanwhile, Jessica left me little notes around the house, in the perfect, looping script she inherited from her mother. Don't forget, Martha hates lilies. Try not to use the east door during the day. Mom needs her quiet. And dining napkins are for guests, not family. They were disguised as helpful reminders, but when I slipped up, the consequences were always public. By Thanksgiving, the pressure had become relentless. Martha insisted that I manage the floral arrangements for the family's charity banquet, one of the town's most anticipated events. She handed me a list that seemed straightforward, but the florist looked confused when I arrived with Martha's instructions. He explained that the flowers she'd requested were out of season. When I returned with the closest alternatives I could find, Martha's disappointment was palpable. "It's not your fault, darling," she said, looking around at the assembled guests, her voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. Some people simply aren't accustomed to our standards. It was around then that I began to suspect I was being set up. The doubts cascaded, little things, but enough to make me anxious with every step I took. I grew quiet at the dinner table, fearful I'd say the wrong thing. I stopped voicing opinions when family friends came over, afraid my words would be used against me. Even Michael noticed my withdrawal. But no matter how much I wanted to tell him how isolated I felt, I just couldn't risk sounding paranoid. I loved him, but I wasn't sure he would believe me. One morning, as I made my way to the kitchen for coffee, I overheard Martha and Jessica talking in one of the side rooms. Martha's voice was hushed, but urgent. "She's making us look foolish," she whispered. "Michael sees her as perfect. We can't let that happen." I froze in the hallway, pressing my back to the wall, my heart drumming in my ears. Jessica replied, "Don't worry, Mom. A few more slip-ups, and even Michael will start to doubt her. She won't last through spring." That conversation was a turning point, a window into the true nature of the games they were playing. I realized then that their kindness was a mask, a tactic. Everything, from the lost mail to the misplaced vase, was deliberate. I wanted to storm into the room, challenge them, shout that I wasn't blind or helpless, but fear held me in place. I waited until I heard their laughter, icy and triumphant, before I dashed up the stairs and locked myself in the bedroom. Over the following weeks, the schemes escalated. When the family's favorite brooch went missing, Jessica found it in my laundry basket, tucked at the bottom. Michael looked at me, confusion and worry etched across his face. "Emily, did you pick it up by accident?" I insisted I'd never seen it before, but the air in the room chilled instantly. Martha, ever the actress, wept at the injustice, but softly urged Michael to forgive quickly, as true family does. He hugged me that night, but I felt the first wedge begin to drive between us. Each accusation, each staged failure, chipped away at my confidence. Sometimes I lay awake at night, replaying every interaction, wondering if perhaps I was losing my mind. That's how expertly they wove doubt. I started to notice a pattern with the house staff, too. The older maids averted their eyes around Martha, but a young woman named Carla sometimes gave me sympathetic glances. One afternoon, I found Carla carefully polishing the silver. Alone, in the pantry, taking a deep breath, I whispered, "Carla, do strange things ever happen to you here?" She hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Best not to notice, Mrs. Emily. The less you know, the easier your life will be. Her words were a warning and a lifeline all at once. Yet the harder they pushed, the more determined I became not to break. I started keeping a notebook, logging every suspicious event, every offhand comment, every accident that seemed too convenient. I stashed it under a loose floorboard in the closet. Piece by piece, a tapestry of manipulation and deceit began to emerge. The loneliness was crushing, but it clarified my resolve. I could let them win, or I could learn their game. So I watched, listened, and waited, breathing through each humiliation, holding tight to the hope that if I could survive this, I could survive anything. Alone most days, I retreated into the one thing that always brought me comfort: my habit of observing the world closely, quietly, and bit by bit, I realized that even in the grandest houses, shadows gather in the corners, and that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who smile while wielding a knife behind your back, turning pain into strength. Night after night, lying awake long after Michael's soft breathing slipped into slumber beside me, I'd stare at the shadows stretched across our bedroom ceiling. Once, those shadows had been soothing, the gentle shapes cast by a streetlight outside, the familiar outline of the maple tree rustling in the breeze. In those early months at the Walker estate, though, they felt darker, more insidious, like reminders of everything I'd lost since leaving my old life behind. I missed my parents' bookstore, where the air always smelled faintly of paper and hope. Missed the way Sam, my little brother, would make me laugh just when I needed it most. Here, I had traded warmth for marble, comfort for caution, and nowhere did I feel that sacrifice more acutely than in those quiet, lonely hours between midnight and dawn. At first, my sadness overwhelmed me. The weight of it pressed into my bones, made every movement sluggish. Most mornings, I pulled myself out of bed, by sheer force of will, hiding puffy eyes under too much concealer. I'd move through the house like a careful guest, always a little on edge, counting, always counting the number of utensils so Martha wouldn't hurl another barbed comment my way, counting the smiles Jessica gave in public versus the cold looks she reserved just for me, counting the things I lost: my sense of belonging, my voice at the dinner table, my confidence. My tears became my secret companions, falling silent into the sink as I washed dishes or curled onto the window seat in the guest room when I couldn't face another family evening. What truly broke me wasn't any one cruelty, but rather how isolated I felt. Like a tree stripped naked in late November, found myself exposed, vulnerable to every sharp wind. Michael, busy and distracted by the family business, tried to reassure me. Just give them more time, Em. They'll come around. But I could feel us drifting. I wanted so badly to confide in him, to explain how every day here brought a new bruise to my spirit. But the words caught in my throat, blocked by fear. What if he thought I was overreacting? Or worse, ungrateful? Every ounce of pain, every humiliation, started to accumulate inside me until I felt I would burst. Sometimes I would close my eyes and imagine myself somewhere else. With each gulp of crisp Vermont air in my memory, I remembered who I used to be: the girl who climbed the tallest trees, who ran barefoot in the first snow, who believed that even the oldest stories could have surprise endings. I wanted to find that fire again, to use the ache inside me as flint, to strike it into something fierce and bright. The first glimmer of resistance. The first step, I realized, was acceptance. I was not the person I used to be, but perhaps that was okay. This pain had changed me. It could destroy me or remake me. So one morning, as I watched the frost melt from the tulip beds outside my window, I decided I would not be a passive victim anymore. If change was inevitable, then let it make me stronger. I began forcing myself to sit up a little straighter, to meet Martha's gaze without flinching. It wasn't easy. The old anxiety never really left. It simply became a companion I learned to live with, like the ache in your ankle after a bad sprain. But every day, just by showing up, by refusing to vanish into the background, I felt a small surge of power returning. I started documenting every odd incident. My journal became my lifeline, a battered leather-bound notebook, pages crammed with dates, observations, and hasty sketches. I slipped it between the mattress and the bed frame each night, unwilling to let anyone glimpse the struggle that now defined my existence. I recorded the accidents and mishaps, including Martha's muttered criticisms and Jessica's sly sabotage. At first, I just wanted to make sense of my world, proof, for myself, that I wasn't imagining things. But soon, I noticed patterns. The alignment of missing items with important family events, the way Jessica's mood soured when I succeeded at anything in public view, the odd silences that fell when I entered a room of staff. I wasn't just collecting pain. I was building a map. As my observations grew, I grew less reactive. The accusations stung, but instead of crumbling, I'd ask careful questions. "Are you sure it was here yesterday, Martha?" I'd offer to help look, knowing the search was doomed, but measuring every word for trace of motive. Sometimes, I actually caught the flicker of frustration in Martha's eyes, a flash of irritation that her games weren't landing like they once did. Reaching out for allies. Up until then, the staff, housekeepers, groundskeepers, kitchen help, had kept wary distance, determined not to involve themselves in the family's affairs. But little by little, I noticed cracks in that wall of professional detachment. Mrs. Parker, the chief housekeeper who'd worked for the Walkers since Michael was a toddler, started seeking me out in quiet moments. She'd share small stories about Michael's childhood mishaps, or ask with genuine concern after my headaches. One evening, after Jessica staged a particularly public humiliation over a missing necklace, Mrs. Parker slipped me a cup of herbal tea and patted my hand. "Sometimes, families are hardest on the ones they fear the most," she said softly, gaze lingering just long enough for me to understand she did see me, and she didn't believe their lies. Then there was Carla, the young maid I'd met in the pantry. One afternoon, I found her weeping, pressed against the wall by Jessica's sharp tongue for a mistake that clearly hadn't been hers. I offered no judgment, just listened. Later, I left a small note in her locker. "You're not alone. Thank you for your kindness." That small gesture sparked cautious trust. She began confiding details she'd witnessed. How Jessica would plant notes or purposely disturb rooms. How Martha once ordered her to rewash, clean, linens as punishment for imagined slights. Through whispered conversations, snatched during laundry folding or dish drying, we exchanged observations and strategies. For the first time in months, I no longer felt completely alone. Redefining myself. With support, however modest, I remembered to nurture myself too. I started rising before dawn, reclaiming just a slice of mornings as my own. Bundled in a sweater and thick socks, I'd stand on the frost-whitened balcony, clutching coffee and letting the cold wind remind me I was alive. Some mornings, I'd walk the garden paths, practicing deep breaths, stretching my limbs toward the sun as if I could absorb its strength. On rare afternoons when the house stilled, I rediscovered my love of reading, sneaking away with tattered novels I found packed in boxes in the attic. Those were stolen moments, but in them I began piecing myself together again. I also returned to some of the creative habits that defined me before. I found an old box of watercolors in a forgotten corner of the attic and started painting again. First clumsy, uncertain flowers, then careful sketches of the estate's grand architecture. No one asked about the bursts of color that began to appear on my desk, but they became reminders that I had talents and dreams beyond the Walker name. Strong days alternated with days of despair. Sometimes, one harsh word from Martha or a particularly cruel snub from Jessica would send me spiraling, questioning whether I was actually making progress or just surviving another day. But each time, the lows seemed a little less bottomless, the recovery a little quicker. I no longer believed every whisper or accusation, at least not for long, preparing for battle. As my strength grew, so did my sense of strategy. I realized that justice would not come if I simply endured. To clear my name, to protect whatever hope I still carried for a future with Michael, I would need undeniable truth, a pattern so clear that even the Walker's web of connections could not obscure it. So, building on my journal's early notes, I began cataloging with purpose. I took surreptitious photos of out-of-place objects, time-stamped texts to myself whenever things went missing or were tampered with, discreetly recorded snippets of suspicious conversations heard through half-closed doors. It felt subversive, even dangerous, but each new piece of data became both armor and weapon. Carla and Mrs. Parker quietly contributed, tipping me off when something seemed amiss, confirming that I hadn't merely imagined the dirty tricks played at my expense. When I felt especially brave, I'd talk to Michael, carefully, cautiously, planting seeds. "Did you notice the vase moved again?" Or, "It's strange, but hasn't Martha seemed stressed these past few weeks?" Sometimes he'd shrug it off, but sometimes he'd look thoughtful, his own uncertainties surfacing. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was the beginning of a shift. For the first time, the foundation beneath Martha and Jessica's schemes felt less stable, forging new strength. One bitterly cold December night, unable to sleep, I wrapped myself in a blanket and tiptoed down to the kitchen. I brewed chamomile tea and stood, staring out at the frozen yard, breath fogging the window. That night, something crystallized inside me. I didn't want revenge, not really. I wanted safety, truth, and a sense of belonging. But I realized those things wouldn't be handed to me. I would need to claim them, stone by stone, even if it meant exposing everything that simmered below the Walker family's polished surface. What surprised me most was how pain became a teacher instead of just a tormentor. Each wound taught me about boundaries, resilience, and the complicated power of kindness, both offered and received. I grew fierce about protecting the people who had helped me, careful with whom I trusted, yet open enough to accept help when it came. I learned to listen, not just to words, but to what wasn't being said, the things that moved in silence, that shaped the currents of life in the estate's grand corridors, turning grief into resolve. By New Year's, I no longer thought of myself as a victim. I was not the scared girl shivering on the far side of the Walker dinner table, nor was I the naive newlywed desperate for approval. I was someone forged in adversity, a woman learning to stand her ground, to look her adversaries in the eye. Instead of shrinking, I found myself growing, sometimes only by millimeters, but always in the direction of light. Through it all, I held on to hope for Michael and me. I began to believe that in telling him the full truth and showing him the proof I'd so carefully gathered, I could both protect our love and break the cycle that had suffocated me for so long. Pain may have been my constant companion in the Walker household, but it had also sculpted me into a force that even Martha and Jessica could not break forever. There came a time when I folded away my tears for the last time, not because the cruelty had stopped, but because I had become too strong and far too determined to let them define the woman I was becoming. I had learned that the greatest strength is not just surviving the darkness, but learning how to transform it, step by painful step, into the first light of a new beginning. The moment of revelation, the transition from secret preparations to outright battle, didn't happen suddenly. It was a slow burn, a guarded hope wrapped in layers of fear, until the day I realized I had enough to tip the balance. For months, I'd gathered proof, notes, photographs, recordings, and testimonies wrapped in shaky handwriting. Each notebook entry was a small rebellion. Each quiet alliance, forged with the staff, was a rare light in an otherwise cold estate. By spring, my maps of deception were as meticulous as any Walker account book. I spent days rehearsing scenarios, lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, revisiting all the smaller humiliations, the whispered insults, and the calculated traps. My stomach would grow cold and tight whenever I imagined Martha's steely eyes facing me across the expanse of their grand dining table. Yet, the more I planned, the less she frightened me. I began to sense a purpose behind the pain, a glimmer of possibility that I could not just survive, but expose the rot beneath their shining veneer. Planting the seeds, it started with subtle shifts. I made sure Michael overheard some of the more suspect exchanges, casually replaying the moments I'd recorded on my phone, never placing blame, merely presenting them as oddities. I worked up the courage to have honest conversations with trusted staff, encouraging Mrs. Parker and Carla to share their stories, how Martha and Jessica would pit the servants against each other, how they doctored accounts to hide mistreatment. I never pressured anyone, but I listened, and gradually, others began to open up, confirming patterns I'd suspected but never fully understood. Simultaneously, Martha seemed to sense my growing confidence. She responded with increasing volatility, her voice sharp during mealtimes, her accusations more pointed. Jessica vacillated between sugary sweetness and withering sarcasm, on edge at any sign that their perfect façade might crack. It was as though they could feel the ground shifting and were scrambling to keep me isolated. As the Walker family's annual spring gala approached, a fundraiser for the hospital wing named after Martha, I knew it was time. The guest list read like a who's who of Maplewood: local politicians, business partners, and distant relatives. If there were ever a moment for truth to burst the bubble, this was it. The Walkers had built their legacy on reputation. I intended at last to hold up a mirror they couldn't look away from. The day of reckoning. Spring came late that year, ushering in a chill that refused to leave the air. On the morning of the gala, the estate hummed with activity. Florists unloaded buckets of white roses and blue hydrangeas, colors Martha had declared regal yet understated. The kitchen rattled with the sound of glassware and the nervous laughter of staff. I moved through the rooms with new steadiness, the weight of my hidden folder, a thick stack of evidence, secure in my purse. Martha, resplendent in navy silk, was everywhere at once, issuing last-minute commands. Jessica floated after her, perfect in her role as the dutiful daughter. When Martha's eyes met mine, there was a flicker of uncertainty, but she quickly masked it with a cool, public smile. Michael, absorbed in discussions with his father about board members and donation tiers, seemed oblivious to the undercurrents swirling beneath the event's glossy surface. That afternoon, as guests began to arrive, I found myself stationed at the entrance, greeting donors I barely knew. Their compliments about the house, the cause, even my dress, felt empty and absurd in the context of everything I'd experienced. I remembered my parents' bookstore, the way neighbors would linger as long as they pleased, never needing an invitation. The contrast was so stark, it made my heart ache. The gala unfolded seamlessly at first. Speeches were made, wine glasses clinked, well-practiced laughter floated across the ballroom. But beneath the shimmering overhead lights, I felt tension snap taut inside me. It was time, unmasking in the lion's den. The gathering reached its peak just after sunset, when Martha called everyone into the grand salon for the main presentation, a celebration of the Walker family's contributions to the community. Michael, standing beside her, looked proud, if a little tired. I stood at the periphery, folder gripped so tightly my knuckles turned white. Martha's speech followed the familiar refrain: gratitude to guests, humble brags about the family's charitable works, a few well-timed anecdotes to keep everyone charmed and engaged. When she finished, there was a ripple of applause. Then she gestured for Michael to say a few words. This was the moment, calculated, deliberate. With all eyes on the stage, I stepped forward and asked, as quietly and politely as I could, if I might say something. A hush fell. It was rare, unheard of, actually, for anyone else to interject at a Walker event. Martha's nostrils flared just slightly, but she nodded, certain the occasion was too public for me to try anything truly damaging. As I faced the assembled guests, an almost out-of-body calm swept over me. I opened the folder, my voice trembling only slightly, as I described what I'd witnessed: the patterns of bullying, the manipulation, and the relentless campaign to discredit me since my arrival. I spoke not from anger, but from a place of exhaustion and unshakable conviction. I described the missing objects, the planted evidence, the cruelty disguised as tradition. Then I let my evidence speak. One by one, I presented dated photographs, screenshots of cruel text messages, testimonies from staff members, names omitted, but circumstances clearly outlined. Most damning were the audio recordings. Martha's clipped voice instructing Jessica on how to correct my mistakes in ways that would embarrass me, and Jessica laughing about setting me up. Each revelation was greeted with sharper gasps, murmurs of disbelief, and then disquieting silence. The family confronts itself. For a full minute, no one moved. Martha's face locked in a rictus of composure, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the salon door. Jessica looked around for support and found none. The guests, people who had spent years basking in the Walkers' reflected glory, now faced the spectacle of the family's inner ugliness, naked under the chandeliers. Michael's reaction was a slow-motion heartbreak. Disbelief warred with recognition on his face. I saw him mentally running back through a year's small inconsistencies and echoes of my pleading. The father, always quieter, stared at the rug as if it might swallow him. Martha's control slipped. She tried, at first, to spin the evidence, suggesting that I'd misunderstood jokes or exaggerated misunderstandings. But the weight of testimony, the clarity of my records, and the voices on those recordings could not be waved away. Not in front of so many witnesses. Jessica tried to justify her actions as protecting the family reputation, but the words rang hollow. As the final audio clip played, guests began to murmur, some looking away, others directly at Martha and Jessica, with expressions of betrayal or faint disgust. More than one guest left early, exchanging glances of unease. The spell of the walker's perfection had been broken, perhaps forever. The aftermath begins. Michael was the first to move. He came to me, not quickly, but steadily, his face drawn with regret. Without a word, he took my hand. That gesture, after so much distance, sent a surge of relief and sadness through me. For all that I had lost, I had not lost him. Martha and Jessica were, essentially, undone. In the days that followed, news of the confrontation rippled through town. Board memberships were suspended, scheduled events quietly withdrawn, interviews with local media canceled. Staff members, emboldened by what had happened, submitted formal complaints and shared additional stories. Michael's father retreated further, behind closed doors, unwilling or unable to protect the family name as he once had. Inside the estate, a strange quiet settled. For days, Martha stalked the halls in a haze of denial, sometimes muttering that it would all blow over, other times swinging between rage and tears. Jessica rarely left her room, emerging only to glare at me wordlessly across the breakfast table before retreating upstairs again. The community's response was sober, but kind. Neighbors I barely knew came by with casseroles or simply offered their support. Mrs. Parker, no longer afraid, gave me an approving nod every time we passed in the hall. Carla actually smiled at me as she dusted the front parlor, her eyes shining with something like hope. Facing myself as the dust settled. Stepping outside one morning, I let the crisp Vermont air cut through the anxiety and exhaustion. I wandered the grounds for a long time, listening to the birds and the distant hum of delivery trucks, letting myself grieve, not just for the illusions I had lost, but for the innocence that had died along the way. My thoughts ran in circles for days. Could any of this have ended differently? Would I have survived if I'd stayed quiet, endured their cruel rehearsals until they grew bored? I doubted it. The walkers wore masks so skillfully, I wondered if they even remembered their own faces beneath. But I found, as time passed, that shame ebbs when sunlight finds it. Telling the truth, hard as it was, freed me from the weight of all those secrets. My pain was real, but so was my strength. And for the first time, I was not alone in bearing witness to either. Michael and I spent long evenings talking, this time with the façade stripped away. He apologized for what he'd missed, for the ways he had dismissed my hurt. Together, we planned what life might look like beyond the estate's iron gates, quietly daring to believe that happiness could be built from the ashes, as long as it was built on honesty. The true power of the moment. That night, lying in bed, I held the silence as a fragile gift. The cost of truth had been steep. We'd all paid for it in lost illusions, in strained relationships, in uncertainty that hovered over our next steps. But in the end, it was a price I was willing to pay. I understood, at last, that the shimmer of wealth and legacy could never compensate for the integrity of a life honestly lived. The Walker's empire would never be the same. How could it be? There's no going back from unmasking those you once called family, no way to reassemble the pieces exactly as they were. But in that raw, unguarded space, I found room for hope. Hope for myself, for Michael, and for the quiet dignity of living a life where the truth did not need to hide. And that's how I confronted the walkers. Not only for my sake, but for everyone who passes through beautiful gates and learns, eventually, that what glitters can also burn. The family falls apart. The days after the revelation unfolded like the slow, inevitable crumbling of a grand old mansion. At first, just a single crack in the plaster. Then a gradual, unstoppable collapse. Even as spring sunlight lingered longer on the Walker estate, the atmosphere inside turned cold, brittle, and silent. It was as though all the years spent polishing the family's image, all the energy invested in appearances, could do nothing to hold back the decay that had been festering behind closed doors. Martha's descent. Martha, once unflappable queen of her domain, was almost unrecognizable. In the immediate aftermath, she attempted to rally, the same way she might have saved a gala gone awry, or turned a business misstep into a public triumph. She sent handwritten notes to influential friends and board members, her words laced with appeals to loyalty and old favors. "These things are misunderstandings," she wrote, "fabrications fueled by jealousy, or perhaps the confusion of new family members unaccustomed to our ways." But no matter how carefully she crafted her apologies, the shimmer of her authority was tarnished. Whispers replaced smiles at the country club. Invitations dried up. Even the oldest allies turned distant, wary of being stained by the scandal's fallout. Some mornings, I would pass her closed study door and hear her on the phone, her voice tight, trying to explain away the audio recordings that had circulated beyond our little world. Other times, I saw her in the garden, standing motionless among the tulips she'd once ordered to be replaced, if even a single petal wilted, staring as though willing the earth to open up and swallow her embarrassment. Martha's temper, contained for so long, began to fray at the edges. She snapped at staff for tiny mistakes. A water glass out of place, a smudge on a window pane. Carla, usually so brisk and careful, once brushed against a vase and nearly dropped it. Martha's voice lashed out, sharp enough to make the girl flinch, but where, once her anger would have sent tremors through the household, now it was met with silence, or at most, with the quiet, measured calm of a staff who'd finally seen the truth. Even Mrs. Parker seemed unimpressed, going about her duties with a deliberate steadiness, meeting Martha's outbursts with a single raised eyebrow and no additional words. Jessica, in exile. Jessica took the collapse differently. After the confrontation at the gala, she shut herself in her suite, refusing to see visitors. The first few days, I'd hear her heels clicking across the bedroom floor, the distant thump of closet doors slamming. I imagined her pacing, rewriting conversations in her head, searching for some thread of control or dignity. Occasionally, a high-pitched voice would drift downstairs in heated argument with Martha, but otherwise, she haunted the halls like a shadow, slipping out only for quick meals, or when she thought the house was empty. One afternoon, I found Jessica in the library, sifting through family photo albums, her cheeks streaked with mascara and frustration. She didn't acknowledge me, but as I left, I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder. The set of her jaw, the tired slump in her shoulders, I saw a woman who had made cruelty into armor, and now didn't know how to survive without it. I wondered, briefly, if she blamed herself or everyone else more. Michael's dilemma. For Michael, the fallout was like waking up from a dream and finding the ground no longer stable beneath his feet. In public, he tried to keep his composure, meeting with lawyers and accountants as questions arose about the Walker Foundation's stewardship. Privately, he was quieter, softer. Sometimes he would find me in the empty breakfast room and sit beside me in silence, his hand reaching for mine under the table. "We should have left long ago," he said one day, voice thick with regret. "Before all this, before things got so twisted." "I didn't want to run," I replied gently, tracing circles on the polished wood. But I won't stay in a house built on hurt and lies." He nodded, and for the first time since we'd met, I saw his uncertainty, not just about the family, but about his own role in keeping their machinery turning. "How do you forgive the people who raised you?" he asked. "Once you see what they're capable of." I didn't have an answer, not then. Forgiveness, I was learning, isn't a single act. It's a quiet, grueling process, stitched together from moments of honesty, distance, and, when possible, empathy. Staff and community shifts. Within the house, a strange equilibrium emerged. The staff, liberated from the expectation of complicity, worked with new confidence. The kitchen hummed again as Carla and the other maids chatted in low voices, no longer tiptoeing around the possibility of being accused or punished for things they hadn't done. Mrs. Parker gave instructions with a calm formality that brooked no nonsense, and in return, the estate ran more smoothly than ever. Without Martha's daily interventions, it was as if a dam had broken. The servants supported one another, sharing news, and occasionally laughter in the hallways. Outside those iron gates, Maplewood itself was in mourning, or perhaps schadenfreude, depending on who you asked. The Walkers were no longer untouchable. Newspaper headlines speculated about financial impropriety. Social media gossiped about those tapes and the GALA incident. I overheard snatches of conversation at the market. "You know, I always thought they were too perfect. That poor girl. Did you see how bravely she spoke?" For the first time in my life, I felt both exposed and strangely powerful. All my hurts, once so secret and suffocating, had become visible, validated by collective awareness. Some neighbors brought casseroles and flowers. A few, who'd once curried favor with Martha, simply crossed the street to avoid me. I didn't care. The worst had already happened, and I'd survived it. Michael and I deciding our future. As the house grew emptier, Jessica making murmurs about moving to New York, Martha retreating further into private misery, Michael and I began to discuss our own departure. The rooms that had once felt so oppressive now seemed like artifacts of a world from which we were ready to walk away. We packed in slow, deliberate stages, sorting through both our belongings and the emotional detritus of the last tumultuous year. One evening, I sat cross-legged on the floor of our bedroom, a cardboard box beside me, leafing through a forgotten stack of letters I'd written to Sam, but never mailed. Michael joined me, his knees bumping mine. "What would it take," he asked, "for us to be happy? Really happy. Not just safe, not just surviving." I thought about my old life in Maplewood, the scent of used paperbacks, laughter echoing through our kitchen, the certainty that love could mean sanctuary instead of strategy. "Let's build something new," I said quietly. "Not another estate. Something honest. Small, maybe. Open. The opposite of all this." He smiled, a little broken, but more hopeful than I'd seen him in months. Farewells and last words. In the week leading up to our departure, I found myself seeking closure in small ways. I thanked Mrs. Parker, who, in turn, patted my arm and said, "No matter where you go, remember you survived the worst." I hugged Carla, promising to write, and slipped her a watercolor sketch of the garden she'd always admired. I went to say goodbye to Martha, though I wasn't sure why. Her study was dim, sunlight caught in dust motes above her desk. "I wish it hadn't gone this way," I began. She looked up, pride and pain flickering in her eyes. "You destroyed everything," she whispered, bitterness coloring her tone. "No," I said, steady and soft. "I just stopped pretending." Jessica never answered my farewell note, but I left it on her pillow anyway, wishing her peace, hoping that someday she'd use her strength for something kinder. Leaving and the road ahead. The day Michael and I left the estate, it was raining, a persistent spring drizzle that blurred the view behind us as we pulled away. I pressed my palm to the window, watching the iron gates recede, feeling a strange combination of grief, relief, and anticipation swirl in my chest. As we drove past the familiar places of Maplewood, the diner where we'd gone on impulsive dates, Sam's favorite park, the stone bridge over the river, I felt the change inside me settle into something permanent. I was not the same person who had stepped, nervous and hopeful, onto the Walkers' perfect lawn so many months before. Michael reached over, covering my hand with his, and we both smiled faintly. "Is this what freedom feels like?" he asked. "It's more than that," I said. "It's a beginning." Reflecting on loss and growth, it would be naive to say I didn't mourn what was lost. I mourned the family I had hoped to join, the ease with which I'd once trusted that kindness would win out over cruelty. I mourned the years Michael had spent hiding parts of himself to fit into his family's story. For a while, I even mourned the grand house itself, the gardens I'd wandered to regain my sense of self, the library with its shelves of unread stories, the echoing halls where I'd learned how deep the pain of isolation could cut. But alongside the mourning came something fiercer, a gratitude for the strength forged in all those lonely, bruising months. I learned boundaries, not just how to set them, but how to defend them. I learned to ask for help, to fight for my version of the truth, to trust my own memory and instincts, even when others tried to rewrite them. In the end, I learned how to love Michael without pretending, and how to love myself enough to leave what had become toxic behind. A new chapter. As the weeks unfolded, Michael and I built a quieter, humbler life. We rented a small apartment above a bakery. I took a job in the local library, finding solace again among the musty pages and gentle regulars. Michael worked for a nonprofit that actually valued transparency. The pace, the space, the lack of spotlights, it all felt miraculous. Sometimes I'd catch myself bracing for a sharp word, a silent accusation, an orchestrated humiliation that never came. But gradually, my defenses eased, replaced by cautious optimism. I painted again. I wrote letters home. I called my brother just to hear him laugh. Slowly, the heaviness lifted. We didn't talk often about the Walkers. When we did, it was not with regret, but with relief. We had chosen the bracing, cold wind over the stifling, perfumed air of secrets. We had chosen each other, as flawed and battered as we were, to be a family that walked in sunlight, not in shadow. Final thoughts. The Walkers' world, once untouchable, enviable, had fallen, not all at once, but piece by inevitable piece. What rose from its ashes, for me, was the conviction that survival isn't mere endurance. It is transformation, to be tested by cruelty and respond, not with more cruelty, but with boundaries and new beginnings, is the greatest power I've ever known. The house might someday crumble or stand empty. The family's name may fade or find a new story to tell, but I will always remember, sometimes escape is not defeat. Sometimes, when a family falls apart, it frees you to build the life you were meant to claim all along. Me, the author of my own happiness. Looking back now, it almost feels like my first life. Maplewood, the Walkers, the golden cage I once mistook for a fairy tale, has split from my present like a skin I finally learned to shed. Some scars remain, of course, and there are days when a sound, a scent, or a polite but pointed remark in a grocery store can summon those old feelings of shame or fear. But more and more often, I find myself living in the light rather than the shadows, When Michael and I moved into the small apartment above the corner bakery, life shrank and bloomed at once. We traded marble floors and sprawling rooms for creaking floorboards, low ceilings, and the daily aroma of cinnamon and fresh bread rising through the cracks. The world's expectations fell silent. Our days became simple and unremarkable to anyone watching from the outside. But to me, each morning felt miraculous. Relearning ordinary joy. For weeks, I woke before sunrise, toes curled against the cool wood, peering out over Maplewood's early mist. I sipped my coffee with the window cracked open, letting the air sting my cheeks and remind me I was free. I walked to the library where I started work, sometimes with Michael, sometimes alone, marveling at how little I missed the layers of artifice and strategy that had governed the Walker estate. Shelving books became my daily meditation. The steady weight of hardcovers and the gentle rustle of pages, a rhythm so far removed from the nervous hush of the Walker halls. I learned the names of regulars. I watched kids flop into beanbag chairs to read about dragons. I chatted with retirees who remembered when Michael was just a big-eared boy on a tricycle. Even small things, stocking bestsellers, wiping dust from forgotten classics, anchored me in my new world. At home, Michael and I tiptoed around each other at first, both carrying our own uncertainty, our own version of grief. But domestic life, in its simplicity, brought its own kind of intimacy. We burned pancakes. We argued about whether to buy fresh flowers every week or save the money for a rainy day. I taught Michael how to fold fitted sheets. He taught me how to use a power drill. Slowly, laughter returned. Not the bright, brittle peal I used to fake at the Walkers' dinner table, but deep, unguarded laughter that left my ribs sore and my cheeks wet. There were moments late at night when we'd share old secrets, the books I dog-eared as a child, the stories Michael had been too embarrassed to tell his mother. Each confession was a stone in the foundation we were finally building on honesty, not fear, faces from the past. For a long time, I didn't see Sam or my parents in person. Calls were easier than explaining everything. When I finally built the nerve to visit the old bookstore, I stood outside for several minutes, just breathing in the familiar scent, ink, dust, and a whiff of my mother's lavender soap. Through the window, I saw my dad ringing up a customer, Sam reading comics on the stool behind the counter, their world moving on, slower but no less steady. The reunion was clumsy. I cried almost as soon as I stepped inside, pressing my face into my mother's shoulder as she smoothed my hair. My father just held me, his large hands gentle as ever, and Sam, older, surer, but still my little brother, wrapped me in a bear hug. For an hour we just sat, saying nothing much. When I told them the broad strokes of what had happened, that the Walkers were not who they seemed, that I'd fought to keep Michael and myself intact, they didn't pepper me with questions. My family never demanded stories before I was ready to tell them. They simply let the silence settle, safe and unconditional. Later, over homemade soup and Sam's teasing jokes, "You miss the world's most boring town meetings, Em." I realized how lucky I was. Some people never find their way back to what matters. Some relationships don't survive the storms. Mine had changed. There was a distance I couldn't ignore, a grief for time lost, but the roots held. Learning to trust again. After so much gaslighting and manipulation, trusting anything, my memory, my instincts, even good intentions from others, didn't come naturally. At first, every small setback or hint of disappointment sent my mind spiraling. Was I failing again? Would Michael tire of this humbler life? Would the townsfolk judge us? remembering only the scandals. It took conscious effort to unlearn those old habits. Sometimes, in the library, I'd catch myself flinching at a sharp tone or shrinking when someone disagreed with me. I had to remind myself, out loud, on occasion, that not every disagreement was an attack, not every mistake a disaster. Working with Mrs. Gutierrez, the library director, helped more than she knew. She was brisk but fair, quick to praise, and just as quick to correct. "You belong here, Emily. Stop asking for permission to breathe," she joked one afternoon, and I found myself smiling days later at the memory. Michael struggled in his own ways. He missed, sometimes bitterly, the security and status his family's legacy had provided. He mourned the father he barely knew and wrestled with the fact that neither apologies nor time would undo the harm done. But he was steadfast, pouring himself into nonprofit work, sitting up late at the kitchen table, drafting grant proposals, or attending tiny community meetings that reminded him power didn't have to mean pride. We learned to support each other in new ways, unlearning old patterns, the silences, the deflections, the suspicions too easily sown by people who once wanted us divided. With every month that passed, we softened, tangled, and grew together in healthier ways, becoming the author. Again, somewhere between unpacking boxes and repainting the kitchen, I began to write again, not just in journals, but in earnest. I started a memoir, sketching memories in hesitant paragraphs, deleting more than I saved, then finding my way back to sentences that sounded like the truth. On weekends, I took a table at the cafe below our window and wrote letters to Sam at college, poems no one would ever read, fragments of books I hoped I might someday finish. The act of writing became more than therapy. It was reclamation. In every line I wrote, I retold my story, from my own perspective, refusing to let the walkers, or anyone, define who I'd become. Some days, I shared my pages with Michael, who read them with an almost reverent silence. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," he said once, thumbing a passage about the earliest days at the estate. That insight carried me through the late-night doubts, the mornings when memory felt more like fog than fact. Word spread in the library that I wrote stories, and Mrs. Gutierrez asked if I'd run a writing group. I agreed, nervously at first, but soon found solace in a circle of voices, teenagers scribbling science fiction, mothers pouring their hearts out in essays, silent men who shared poems about grief. Those meetings, with their warmth and their vulnerability, were a weekly reminder. Everyone is remaking themselves, all the time, in small and hopeful ways, redefining happiness. If you asked me when I was living at the Walker estate what happiness looked like, I might have pointed to a beautiful dining table set just so, a smile of approval from Martha, or the recognition of my efforts at a grand party. I thought comfort meant being accepted, being invisible, being the woman they could love because she created no ripples. Now, happiness has little to do with other people's opinions or the shimmer of any surface. It's the hush over fresh pages when I write. The weight of Michael's arm draped lazily over my waist on a Saturday morning. The laughter from a table of friends who've known loss as well as love. It's the pride I see in my dad's eyes when he hears about a story I've published in the local paper, or the warm, lingering hug when Sam visits and we talk about fears I used to keep secret. Happiness is forgiveness. Of others, yes, but mostly of myself. For years, I mistook survival for weakness, assuming I had failed by not being braver sooner. Now, I see that survival is its own kind of courage, and that kindness towards myself is the soil from which every future hope can grow. A quiet rebellion. Though I never craved attention, my story spread further than I intended. One day, a woman I didn't know stopped me at the bakery. "You're Emily, aren't you? From the Walkers. My cousin worked the gala. She said you were the bravest person she ever saw." I blushed, stammering some response. But later, sitting at my desk, I realized bravery isn't always about public confrontations. Sometimes it's choosing to show up when it's easier to disappear. A few others, women from town, wives of local businessmen, even staff from the Walker estate, reached out quietly. They shared their own stories of being silenced, of surviving in golden cages. We compared notes in whispers and in laughter. There was no shame left in those conversations, only proof that we are stronger together, that truth multiplies when it is spoken aloud. The life I choose. It would be misleading to say that pain vanishes, that old ghosts don't show up when I least expect it, whispering of things I might have done differently. Sometimes I still dream of the estate, the echoing halls, the roses in Martha's vases, the cold glint in Jessica's eyes. But each time, the dream ends the same way, with me walking out the front doors, into the dawn, into a world I now know I have power, at last, to shape. Michael and I still argue, still struggle sometimes with money or uncertainty, or the fear that we are somehow irreparably changed. Yet, sitting across from one another at our chipped kitchen table, I know what we've built cannot be shattered by anyone else's secrets. If happiness must be written anew each day, claimed, not granted, then that's the story I choose to live. I am the author now, not merely an heir to someone else's design. Moving forward, when I look in the mirror, the woman staring back is softer and stronger than the girl who first left Maplewood. Her smile is quieter, but much more real. Her eyes are wiser, edged with memory, but clear with hope. I am no longer waiting for permission to be safe, or loved, or happy. I grant myself those things, imperfectly, but sincerely, every day. Sometimes, when Michael wraps his arms around me in the grocery store, or Sam texts a stupid meme that makes me laugh until I cry, I realize that even broken stories can be mended, not erased, but rewritten. That is my real inheritance. Not the Walker's name, not their money, not their legacy, but the hard-earned knowledge that I decide what happiness means. That I, Emily Thompson, am the author of my own beginning, middle, and, one day, my own bright, hard-won, happy ending.